Bienvenidos, Ushamdi, and welcome to this Hut8 networking Techtorial on the Cisco ASA firewall basic configuration. In this module, module number 8, we're going to be taking a look at AAA, in other words, Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting, as well as DHCP, the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. So let's go ahead and dive in here. And first we're going to talk about AAA. Right? Authentication, Authorization, and Accounting, and it's used to enhance device administrative access security. And what we mean by this is think of the scenario where you configure a device, and it could be a router, it could be a switch, or a firewall. And you have to configure the enable password in order to move from user exec into privilege exec. And so here's a great use case for AAA, is that you can force the user transitioning from user exec to privilege exec to have to enter in their authentication information instead of everyone using a password that everybody knows. And so that's one huge benefit of AAA. The other benefit is the authorization perspective. Say you want to limit the types of commands or the level of commands that are being run. You've got someone that's doing an audit and the only thing they need to be able to do is show run. So you could set that up so that they can only do a show run. And then you've got accounting, where you can actually track and keep a record of every command that's being run during a user's session. And this becomes very handy in scenarios where all of a sudden the firewall reboots for no reason at all. And there was a network administrator who was just up in the data center and comes down, and you ask him, hey, what were you doing on the firewall? And he says, oh, nothing, I was just looking at the config. Well, with the accounting aspect, you can go back and take a look at that information. Now, there's two types of AAA, excuse me, it's local-based or server-based. And what we mean by local-based, and that's what we're going to be talking about, because that is at the introductory level, that's an appropriate topic, is that local authentication on the ASA itself using the local AAA database. In other words, it's that username command that we enter in when we create user accounts. That's your local AAA database. And then there's server-based. And you could do this with the Cisco ACS, or if you need a TACACS, or if you've got the Identity Services Engine, which is Radius only, or was the last time I checked. I'm not sure about the new version, but that's always been a point of contention, that ICE, the Identity Services Engine, when it first came out, it could only do Radius. And again, I'm pretty sure that it's still Radius only. At some point, it was going to transition and offer TACACS, but the reason that it didn't offer TACACS right out of the gate wasn't because Cisco couldn't figure out how to do it. It's because Cisco was still selling the ACS appliances, and they still are today, and the appliances and the virtual machines and stuff. So had they put the TACACS functionality into ICE, then why does anybody need to buy Cisco ACS anymore? So again, a little inside baseball there, but remember that it's local, right, or server-based. And we're going to be talking about local in this video here. Now, the consoles, and this, for whatever reason, I don't know why they chose the word consoles, because when you hear the word console, what do you think immediately? Exactly. You're thinking about the physical console port on the ASA firewall, or the physical console port on the ISR, the 2911, or the 4451, right? You're thinking of a physical port, but that is not what that word, and you're going to see it when we type in, we're going to be typing in AAA authentication, HTTP console, and you've seen that already, or AAA authentication. What was one of the other ones we did? You could do serial, which, and that's the thing, serial refers to the physical console port, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So you could do it for HTTP, SSH, Telnet, the enable password. So we're going to enable all of those with the exception of Telnet, because we won't be using Telnet. So again, there's a keyword that you'll see, console, but it does not mean the physical console port. What it means is it's referring to the method list, right? And let me get down to the commands here and you'll see what I'm talking about. So local, that is how in the method list you specify the local user database. And you can specify multiple methods with which to authenticate with AAA. So I could say, TACACS and put the name of the TACACS group, and then local is my fallback, right? And you always want to make sure you have a fallback. And one of the most important things to do as soon as you get logged in is you want to create local user accounts. Now, again, this is given the scenario that we're working with where we have a single ASA, and obviously, if all we have is a single ASA in the office or the home office or whatever the case may be, you probably don't need a full-blown Radius server or a ACS appliance to do TACACS or anything like that. So this is the use case for sort of that small deployment. Now, the key commands, right? So here you'll see the command syntax. It's just AAA authentication. It's very similar, at least the AAA authentication part, to what you would see on iOS with an ISRG2 router, right? So you say AAA authentication, and then what is it? What method, or I shouldn't say what method, what means are you connecting via, right? Or by which means are you connecting? And so are you using the enable password? Are you using SSH? Are you using the serial, which is actually the console port? HTTP, are you connecting via HTTP? It's going to refer to that local database. And again, we can limit the amount of attempts to 3 to sort of prevent those brute force attacks. But you'll notice consistently it's console local, console local. And when you see console, think method, right? So which database am I accessing? Right? What method am I using to perform? Not which connection methodology am I using, SSH, serial, HTTP, enable, but which database am I using? So when you see console, think method list. And again, it's in all of these authentication commands that we're looking at here. Now, remember I said local is case sensitive. And again, it would be great, I'm not sure if it's possible to clean this up maybe in a future ASA release, but take a look down here at this command. When I say AAA local authentication attempts, but it's lowercase. And we'll look at that because we're going to configure this. So when we look at that, you'll see that for whatever reason, it's not referring to the database, right? And again, that's one of the reasons that you've got that the differentiation there. Why it's different is when it's uppercase, right, in all caps, that is the reference to the local user database. When you see it used in lowercase here, right, it's not referencing the database as part of as a method, right? It's referencing the method of using. I mean, it's kind of difficult to describe. So let's get on the command line. Let's walk through it here, and hopefully this will give you a better example. So here we are, and in fact, I think this is right where we left off the other day. Now remember, the advantage, because you're probably asking yourself, well, what's the big deal? If I'm doing this locally and I have to create, username Bob, password, and we'll just, password Bob, username Steve, password Steve, you're probably saying to yourself, well, if I have to create these user accounts anyway, what's the big advantage with AAA? Well, remember, in a small deployment like this, you're going to have to create these usernames anyway, but in a small deployment, the benefit is going to come from that AAA authentication enable command, where they're going to have to enter their own credentials in order to get into privilege exec, right? So it could be to where you've got a bunch of administrators, but maybe only 2 actually know what that enable password is. So we'll say enable password, and we'll just say Cisco, right? So if I say show run include enable, there's the enable password, right? And it's encrypted here, and it's just Cisco. If I say show run pipe include username, you can see we've got Travis, Steve, and Bob. So now let's go ahead and configure AAA. Now you're probably used to seeing this command here, AAA new model, if you're familiar with iOS. And you'll notice that that command does not exist. So you don't, and in fact, it doesn't exist. Or did I misspell it? No, I didn't misspell it. I thought I may have misspelled it. It doesn't exist anyway, but I wanted to make sure I spelled it correctly. So AAA new model doesn't exist. It doesn't need to be enabled on the ASA. It's already there, so we can jump right in. So let's go ahead and right out of the gate, let's say AAA. And if I do a question mark, and the reason I'm doing the question mark is I want to call this out right here. So you can see that local, remember we use this for the max attempts. So I say AAA local, and there's only that one option, authentication, attempts, max fail, and then the number. And so we'll say 4, right? So when it's lowercase here, right, it's not referring to the database, right? It's referring to the fact that we're using the local database for authentication. I know it's kind of difficult, and I'm probably not describing that very well, but again, we're not pointing to, and maybe this is a better way, we're not pointing to the local user database when we use it lowercase like this. We're saying that if you're using local as the authentication method, then yeah, you get 4 attempts before it fails out. But when we use it in uppercase, we're pointing at the local user database using the local user database. And so let's put those commands in here. So we'll say AAA authentication. And here are the different the ways we can do it, right? And so we'll do the enable password. And remember, console is going to be important. Now that command right there means the next time I try to go into privilege exec from user exec, I'm going to have to enter in my credentials, not the enable password. And so then it turns into kind of an easy exercise here. So we'll change the enable to serial. So now when I access the console, I have to enter in my credentials. When I go to access HTTP, I have to enter in my credentials. When I go to access the firewall via SSH, I have to enter in my credentials, right? So this is a great way to add a little additional protection, and again, and very little protection, but you're definitely enhancing how you have things set up. So if I was to go ahead and say, write mem, and then let me go ahead and log out here, right? Type exit, and now take a look. I have to enter my credentials in, right? So this is definitely a significant benefit because prior to this, we were presented with the user exec prompt. We could have run some commands because it's allowing us access to the CLI. With AAA, we no longer have that sort of quote-unquote default access setup. So now I would have to say Travis, and I think it is Cisco, and there we go. And so we're logged in. So now when I type enable, remember, before I did the AAA, it would come up and prompt me for the password when I had the enable password, and now it prompts me for the password as well, but which password? So we did ABC123, I'm hoping. I wanted to make it different than Cisco, or did I make it Cisco? All right, so let's type in Cisco, and now we're in, but let's do this. I think the enable password, I thought it was ABC123. Yeah, so let's do that, and let me exit out again. Want to make sure it's different. So we say Travis, Cisco, go to transition from user exec to privilege exec, and I'm going to type in ABC123 and hit enter, and look what happens. So that enable password, right, you can add a little additional protection, making and forcing all users to use their password, right? Their login credentials. So now I'm going to type in Cisco, and we are in, right? And so again, when we talk about the AAA, it definitely adds a little protection, a little additional protection that wasn't there initially. And when you go to move into an enterprise environment, when you want to add in the accounting, right, or you want to add in the authorization, like which commands can be run, then it really becomes extremely powerful. But for a small deployment, this is pretty much all we need. So if I were to say show run include AAA, right, there's the AAA configuration. And so that is pretty much it for AAA, and you definitely want to make sure that you have AAA enabled. So now let's talk about DHCP, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. So basic DHCP configuration. As of right now, how are we set up? Yeah, you remember we're 10.0.0.0/24. I've got this iMac here is .11. The MacBook that we were using is .10, and we're assigning static addresses. But if you were to deploy this at your house, you wouldn't want to do that, right? Just like when you drop a Linksys in or a D-Link, or whoever your, the Comcast or the Action Tech router that you get from Verizon or whatever you're going to use, it's already typically set up to provide DHCP services. Now, we're going to go ahead and we're going to walk through this, and we're going to do it from the CLI. And the command is dhcpd, right? And you can think of that D as daemon, right? So the DHCP daemon, it's going to be running that DHCP process in the background. And so we're limited to 32 addresses. So if I were to come back to the command line, let's take care of this right now. DHCPD, right? I say address, and you can see here it says addresses. So it's the first IP in the range, and then a dash, and then the last IP in the range. So if I was to say 10.0.0. and we'll start at 150 and go to 10.0.0.200, that's 50 addresses, right? So when I hit enter here, what should we get? Exactly, we should see I need to put the interface on which we're going to be doing that. We should see an error message that comes up and tells us, warning, DHCP pool range is limited to 32 addresses. So set the address range as 152, and it gives us, it's nice, right? It's going to give me the max. So remember, with the base license, we're limited to 32 DHCP addresses. And if you think about it, just like the 3 VLAN limit, it makes sense. In a home environment, chances are, if you're using the base license, chances are you're not going to need 32 DHCP addresses. I consider myself to be pretty abundant in terms of devices floating around the house with my daughter, my wife. I've got friends that come over, and I never usually get up to 32 DHCP addresses being used, right? So small office, home office, it works out well. Let's take advantage of that max range there, and we'll say 181. So what I've just done is I've defined the range, right? So the next thing we want to define is, and of course the zone into which you want to run it. I'll change this here. I need to put the inside there. So what interface do I want to enable DHCP on? Well, I could say DHCPD enable, and then you can pick the inside interface, right? Because that's the interface on which we're giving the addresses out. We need to enable that DHCPD process. And so then, without going back to the slide, we can quickly see that all of the DHCP options we have here, there aren't too many. So I can configure a domain name. So let's say domain, hut8.com, DHCPD, and we can do the least length, right? How long do we want to let somebody have it? And I think the default's 36. I think 86,400 or 84,600, I can't remember which, is 24 hours. So we'll just simply put in the least time is 86,400. Let me go ahead and say DHCPD and DNS. We'll put in the DNS server. We'll use Google's DNS server, right? And if I was to say show run include DHCPD, There we go. So we've got a DNS address, we've got a lease time, we've got the hut8.com. If I wanted to check and see, instead of show run and running it through there, I could say show run dhcpd, right, as well, and that's going to give me much the same information as I had before. So now you're probably wondering, there's typically one question that always comes up, and that is, well, I think that's great, but you forgot something. Where is the default router, right? Where's the default gateway setting? So if I say dhcpd and I do a question mark, you can see that there's no default, no keyword default here, right? We did the address, we did DNS, we did the domain, enable, we got the lease. So how are we going to do this, right? How is this going to work? Well, by default, the ASA will auto-magically give clients the IP address of the interface on which you enable DHCP, right? So it's auto-magically done for you. The ASA is smart enough to know that if you're enabling DHCP on one of the interfaces on the ASA, that it's going to use that same interface. It's going to say, hey, I'm your layer 3 boundary here, so come to me for DHCP information, right? And I'll respond, and obviously it's going to be responding to those requests, right? The DORA, the discover, the offer, the reply, the acknowledgement. So let's test this. Let's make sure, again, I'd like to lab it up to see what is it actually going to do. So we'll use, and boy, oh boy, we're pinging away here. It's been pinging for a while. Excuse me. So let's use the iMac here. In fact, let me go ahead and kick off. Let's let this ping run here, and let me pull up, where are my system preferences. So here is the Ethernet connection I'm using, right? And you can see I've got it done manually. Well, let's go ahead. Let's change this. I'm going to say DHCP and click apply. So it says using DHCP. You can see we've lost connectivity, but take a look at what just happened. We picked up the 10.0.0.150. Remember, the first address in our range. We picked up the subnet mask of a /24, and it knows that because that is the subnet mask on the interface on which we enabled it. And as promised, there is the default router value, the 10.0.0.254. And so it's picked up all of this information here. Now, you can see here it also got the search domain. We picked up the hut8.com. And I believe the reason this is failing is because of one of the ACLs that we may have set up. So let's do a little troubleshooting here. Let me see, show run access list. And no, we are any. So we're any all the way around. And let me make sure I can ping the, ping the default gateway here. So let's say Control C. So ping 10.0.0.254. And we absolutely should be able to ping the default gateway, and we can. And we've got two default gateways. And I'm wondering, because this is this iMac, so I have another default gateway that's pointing to 192.168. So I'm wondering if that is in play here. So we might come back to this. I might just let this go. The key being that we picked up all of the information that we thought we would. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to change it back to manually. And we'll say OK. And let's change it back to 10.0.0.11 and then get rid of that default, and we're going to click apply. And we're going to come back to the use case now that we just discussed, which was, okay, DHCPD, I don't want the DHCP server to automatically give the default gateway address for whatever the case may be, right? So this is where we get into options. And you can see it doesn't give you much information other than to ask you for the code. The code just happens to be 3, right? And then we're going to provide the IP address. Now again, this use case right here, this doesn't make much sense because if it's going to do it automatically for me, then let it do it automatically, right? There's no need for me to put this option in here, but for whatever reason, if you needed it to give out a different address, this is how you would do that. And so I just simply say dhcpd option 3, and in fact, let me do this. Let's make it something, let's say 192.168.1.254. And because if I was to do this, we wouldn't be able to tell, I wouldn't be able to conclusively say, see, this is how you put an address in, you override the default behavior, because it would be the same. So I'm going to change it to that, and if we see that, the 192.168, we know definitely we overrode that default behavior. So let's say show run include AAA. I'm sorry, not AAA. Still in the early stages of the module. We're going to say dhcpd, and there we go. And you can only specify a single default gateway. So now when we come back to the client and we flip it back to DHCP and I click apply, we wait a couple seconds here. What do we get? Oh, you know what I just did? Oh, no, I didn't. Okay. We click apply, and we're looking at the Ethernet here, and it looks like it doesn't like that. Give me a second here. Let's see if we can do a show run DHCPD. Oh, yeah, so that default gateway setting is going to cause, is that going to cause an issue? Or is it the fact, show run DHCPD, oops, DHCPD. Yeah, let me take that out real quick here and see if it's the fact that it doesn't like it because it's not on the same subnet. Again, I've never had to use a different address other than the interface address. So let's do this, DHCPD option 3, and I'm going to say IP 10.0.0. and let's just say 111. So if it's on the same, you know what? I simply wasn't patient enough, right? So that's bad on me. It came back a little quicker the first time, right? And we waited a little, and that was almost like BGP-esque, the amount of time it took to get that, but it did get it, and you can see we got a different address here. But that is definitely how you override it. So again, I just didn't wait long enough, wasn't patient enough, but it did pick up that DHCPD option 3 setting that we had put in there. And so we're good with that. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to a manual configuration of 10.0.0.11, and we'll get rid of that because we don't want that. All right, so that is the basic DHCP setting, right? So remember, with the base license, the major challenge is going to be 32 addresses. If you've got more than 32 devices, you could be in trouble. And we talked about overriding that default gateway address for whatever the use case may be. And it does work. We just needed to be a little more patient. All right, well, definitely one of the shorter modules. Now we are definitely going to get into some fun stuff. So we're going to be taking a look at setting up the SSL VPN as well as Anyconnect VPN. And this is also where I'm going to demonstrate how you can, for free, right? You can get the iPhone, or I shouldn't say the iPhone or the iPad, it's the same app. You can get the Anyconnect app for your iPhone or for your iPad. And if you're on the road and for whatever reason you needed to connect to something remotely or to get onto your home network, I'm going to show you how to do that. And I'm also going to show you how to perform port forwarding. So maybe you want a remote desktop into something using VNC server, right? Or the VNC client to attach to a VNC server on your local network. And so we'll look at the port forwarding. Again, very straightforward and very easy to accomplish. And that is going to wrap up Module 8. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in Module number 9.